Hello, my name is Robin, otherwise known as Not the Bird, and this is my introductory series into the Gem Editor. For this first episode, we're mainly going to be looking at the workflow you would have and structure you'd have when creating your own environment inside the F2 mode within the editor. I'm not going to be really explaining controls or going through UI panels. I'm going to leave that till later episodes. I'm also not going to talk about scripting or anything to do with mod packing and file packing. This is just going to be looking at what goes into creating a scene and placing a couple of things down in it, just to kind of get the idea of the steps you should be hitting when making your own scene within the editor. To begin with, I'm just selecting a 100 by 100 grid for a small space and chose a dirt texture just to start us off, so we've got an idea of what the ground's going to look like. Now we're going to sculpt some hills into the map using the height tool and just giving ourselves some natural looking ridges and a bit of a valley to start our scene off. Generally, you'll always start with making your mountains and hills first, as it gives you almost like a sketch out of what you're going to be turning into a landscape to finish with. It's easier to start with building hills and then placing things on them than placing things down and then building hills underneath them, if that makes sense. After we've created our setup of some hills, the next main step I'd generally go to would be texturizing the floor. So selecting some more textures apart from just our standard dirt texture, and kind of giving ridges a look of being rocky, so there's a kind of difference between cliff faces and flat surfaces. We're also going to create another texture palette between a muddy texture and a grassy texture to help create floor areas in the environment. Texturing, generally, you can kind of, just like with height, you can jump in and out of it at different times and do it at different points, but I recommend getting the bulk of it done at the start, just so that you've kind of got the guidelines for what your map's going to look like and you're not kind of trying to draw under objects later on. And you can always change things later if you do need to kind of redraw the lines you've drawn out. After we've textured and set up some sort of height to the map, an important step, which again you can come to later in design, but I would generally map out to begin with, is your terrain types. So you're basically at this point telling the editor what the surfaces actually represent. So what kind of physical effects they'll have on units. So that could be like, if it's a road, it speeds the unit up. If it's, you can see now I'm drawing these red areas, that basically means these are impassable bits of land because they're mountainous. But it also is how you would select what effects would appear when things explode. So if you see now the green areas, if a bomb goes off there, that's going to tell it that to blow up in a kind of grassy effect instead of mud. After we've done with terrain editing, we're moving on to placing grass down onto the map. This isn't the same as prop placing floral items. This is more like a kind of randomly generated grass, which will help give a bit of height and verticality to the kind of green areas of the map, instead of them just being like perfectly flat, painted on textures onto like rock or dirt. Also, it just makes the map look a bit more natural, and saves you time in having to place down 100 little bits of grass into props. Next, I'm going to be moving on to doing a little bit more height editing to map out a trench for the start of our prop placement. So I'm just kind of now finding a little spot where I was overlooking this valley and kind of carving out a little bit of a bunker shape, which I'm then going to start placing sandbags down into. So this is going to be the start of our prop editing. This is going to be the main bulk of what you do inside of Gem Editor in creating your map. This is going to be the longest point, like the part of your editing, and it's generally going to take the most fiddling and the most amount of time, apart from maybe scripting, which I think is quite up there in terms of being quite fiddly. But this is generally the bulk of your workflow is going to be in this section here. It takes To make something look good, it can take quite a lot of time of adjusting and fiddling, but it's worth doing it to get natural looking environments and things. And if like, all it takes is a couple of wrong place props and you can really break people's immersion. So it's very important to make sure that you've got everything in the right place in this section, because it's one of those parts of the workflow which really does make or break a map. So if you're new to the gem editor and you're not really sure what props you do have at your disposal, I recommend just opening a small file before trying to create anything big and just giving yourself an idea by dragging out some of the props and having a look and seeing what you might want to work with, so you don't end up with 100 fences and then finding another fence that you like more and having to delete all the old ones. You just having a pre-planned idea of the props and assets you're going to use to create your environment is never a bad thing. Finally, after placing these trenches and sandbags down, I'm just going to quickly sculpt out the land a little bit more and then place some stamps to give the ground a bit of a more of a dugout feel and a bit more detail. So stamps are almost kind of predetermined little textures which can be used to hide seams in your actual texturing of the floor. They're not auto-generated like ground texturing is. It's more of like an asset you're placing, or like a 2D asset placed onto the ground. Thanks for joining me in my very first episode of my gem editor tutorial series, and hopefully you've got a little bit more of an idea and understanding of the workflow you're going to be looking at when inside the editor, and hopefully you'll be joining me for my second episode where we'll be looking at some more key concepts within environment design.